Sirens were already fading into the trees when the screaming started again. Flashlights slashed at the dead trunks, men shouted over radios that crackled with bad reception, and the professional search grid fell apart right in front of him. Cole Mercer didn't wait for permission, didn't wait for the chief's signal or the checklist or the prayer. He grabbed the small pink windbreaker from a mother's shaking hands, brought it to the noses of his two scarred dogs. Paws steady and low, paths quivering like a strung wire, and said in a voice that cut through the panic, "Find her." Then stepped off the road and into the black ribs of the burned forest, as if the dark were a doorway made only for them. The gym where the evacuees slept still hummed behind him like a beehive. Generators muttered arguments, a baby crying because babies don't know how to be quiet when the world becomes ash, and someone called his name as if a name could hold him back. The smell of antiseptic and pine ghosts clung to his shirt, but out here the odor shifted to wet charcoal and cold iron. Underfoot the ground sighed and gave a little the way scorched soil does when a hidden pocket of heat breathes out. Paws moved first, nose close, tail low, shoulders working in a quiet churn. Paths hopped once, twice eager, then remembered the pain and dropped into a pace that matched his brother. Cole kept the windbreaker open like a flag, letting the air move through it, letting the scent lift. He didn't look back. He had learned in other hot places long ago that looking back puts a hinge on your spine. Ahead, somewhere past the shattered silhouettes of lodgepole pines, a child had run toward the wrong kind of quiet, and every second that bled away took heat from her core. He'd sworn after the fire he wouldn't come here again. He'd stood on the ridge with a line of neighbors and watched the orange wall run like a living thing. Then he had helped carry boxes that weren't heavy enough to be lives, out to trucks that weren't big enough to be salvation. Then he had crawled into a FEMA box with thin walls and thinner patients and pretended sleep was a place you could still go. The dogs had come to him inside that hum of fluorescent night. Paws pulled from a culvert with eyes that understood too much. Paths dug out from under the corrugated lip of an old shipping container where the heat had curled the paint like scales. Dr. Marisol Green, whose hands could be both stern and gentle in the same breath, had stitched and salved and whispered to them words that weren't for him, and he had felt a stupid, unreasonable jealousy that the dogs could absorb comfort and return it as trust, while he had only learned to wear calm like a coat he didn't deserve. He named them Paws and Paths because he needed the reminder. One was the steady ground he could stand on, the other was the route he could still take. Now, the forest opened the way a bad memory does too quickly, with details too sharp. Cole lifted his head to taste the breeze, an old habit that had saved him in deserts and alleys, and once in a canyon he never talked about. Night air slid down the charred trunks, like oil pooled in hollows, and then crept sideways where the valley pinched. He folded the jacket, rubbed its cuff between two fingers, to release more scent crouched, until he felt his knees complain, and let Paws press his broad muzzle into the fabric. The shepherd's eyes changed the way a sky changes when weather decides itself soft to focused, patient to locked. Paths circled twice, nostrils fluttering, then froze, with one paw lifted, as if even the ground needed permission. "Good," Cole said, and the word came out too gentle. He hardened it with the next one. "Track." They moved. Behind him, Hank Adler's baritone rolled through the trees, ordering a flank sweep that would never reach this far this fast. Hank had been a fire chief before the bureaucracy caught up with his knees. In the gym earlier, he'd said to Cole, "You can come with a team if you're up to it," and Cole had nodded like a man who could compromise with his ghosts. But when Renee Carter's voice cracked around the name Lily, when her husband Tom started to run in a straight line, because straight lines are what fathers do when they can't think, Cole understood that some kinds of caution were a prettier word for delay. Now he lifted his radio and pressed the button he wished connected him to more than static. "Mercer moving east along Old Creek Bed," he said. 2 K9 seconds, I'll mark with voice if I call." He let the call hang. No one answered. Fine. They slid down a spill of powder-fine ash into what had once been water. The creek bed wore a necklace of rocks gone milk-white from heat. Paws paced the stones the way a careful man tests a bridge. Paths leapt a gap, because bravery and impatience share a language, then skidded, caught himself, and looked back at Cole with that embarrassed brightness dogs use when they pretend almost falls were planned. "You're good," Cole said. He did not say, "I almost wasn't." He did not say, "I still hear the crack when a ridgepole gives, and I still smell the paint on the kitchen door when everything else is smoke, and I still feel the air change in my ears right before that noise that is not a sound, but a violence." He followed the dogs because forward was the only verb that mattered. They passed the dead steeple before he remembered he'd meant to avoid it. Eagle Creek's church had been the kind of white that looks like mercy in winter photographs. Now it rose like a single black finger from a fist of rubble. Paws stopped without being told to, and stared at the broken doors. Not a quick look, not a curious sniff, but that staring that dogs do when they sense something that isn't about eyes. Path's hackles lifted as if a static charge had crawled up his spine. Cole stood very still. Wind swirled a cone of ash across the threshold, and the sound it made was too delicate for a place this ruined. "Not now," he murmured, and the words felt like a promise he'd regret. Paws held the stair one beat longer, then broke it, not back toward town, but downstream, as if the church were a signpost nobody had drawn. Paths bounded after him, and the two noses stitched a path the human eye couldn't see. He thought about Lily the way he knew he shouldn't, not as a missing person in a grid square, but as the girl who had pressed herself against the chain link outside the veterinary tent 2 weeks ago to watch Dr. Green wrap a bandage around Paws' hip, breath fogging the metal, whispering, "You're brave," with the absolute sincerity of 8 years old. She had looked up at Cole then, and he had looked away. He wondered ridiculously, uselessly, what book she had been reading the night she put that jacket down. The mind betrays you this way. Under pressure, it offers questions that feel like care but are actually delay. The only honest question is, where? Where turned out to be a smellfold in the air the shape of a question mark. Paws halted, head up, nostrils flaring, then dove left off the creek bed into a stand of blackened saplings, as if taking a door that had appeared between two breaths. Paths cut wide, one ear cocked toward his brother, one toward the wind, a double aware that had saved the team twice in training when a volunteer had tried to distract them with a tossed glove. Cole pushed branches out of his way and caught the same hint, a second late: skin salt, shampoo, sugar gum, a thread of fear so thin it felt like temperature. "On it," he said, but the dogs didn't need encouragement. They drove toward a low rise where the burned soil had slumped after a hard rain, revealing a scalloped edge like the rim of a pie someone had cracked with a fist. Paws approached the lip and stopped dead. Paths stepped to his shoulder and did a strange thing. He looked up, not down, as if listening for air, coming from a place air shouldn't. Cole slid on his belly to the edge and held his light down. Blackness stared back then, gave up shape by inches, a hollow, a crawl space, a brickwork that had never been visible before. The fire took the forest's secret and made it honest. He heard nothing. Then a small sound came to the surface, like a bubble. Not a cry, not the giddy chatter rescuers train themselves to hear, but a tiny caught breath that could have been a trapped animal, or the patient inhale of fear right before it chooses to make a noise on purpose. Lily, Cole said, careful with volume the way you are careful with glass. "It's Cole from the dogs. We're close." Somewhere behind him the radio finally snarled to life. "Copy Creekbed," East Hank said. "We're pushing a line to you. Tag with sound if you can." Cole kept his gaze on the hole. "Hold," he said into the mic, "because there are times when more feet are just more noise." Then louder to the dogs, "Speak." Paws gave one deep bark, the kind that lands low, a calm drum. Paths matched him with two bright, clean barks, like flares. The air changed its mind. It came up from the hole with the news of breath and damp dirt, and with it came the unmistakable rustle of something that wanted closer. "Good," Cole whispered, and for the first time since he'd stepped off the road, He let himself feel a thread of hope, thin as fishing line. He reached for his rope, then remembered he hadn't brought the pack he used to keep by the door of a house that no longer existed. Improvisation had been his trade once. It was a muscle that never really atrophies. He took the windbreaker, looped the sleeves through his belt, and made a sling he could bite down on if he had to hold weight. Down he told Paws palm flat stay, but not the command that would have frozen him. This was trust, not control. To Paths, he said, watch because someone had to keep the world from coming from the side, while he made himself stupid at the edge. He slid further chest over nothing, and aimed his beam. A pale oval appeared, then eyes, then a mess of hair. Lily blinked up into the light like small animals do when the world has been only one color for too long. Her mouth opened. Don't yell, Cole said gently. You'll waste air. We've got you. Can you move your feet? The answer took a long time. Then it came in that stubborn near whisper kids, save for grown-ups, they've decided to trust. My ankle hurts. Good, he thought, because pain means not dead. Okay, we won't pull you on it. I'm going to lower the jacket. Can you grab with both hands? Another long beat. Yes. He fed the sleeves down and felt the soft, testing tug of small fingers, then a harder grip. He bit the cloth to anchor it, refused to think about the angle of his spine, and reached with his free hand into the dark until his fingers met the crown of a head, then the curve of a shoulder slick with cold dirt. Slow, he said, and he could hear the men who had trained him in the word. The jacket hummed under his teeth. Paws made a sound in his chest, like a held note. Paths stood with his front paws braced, and his head lifted toward the wind, with that weird second listen that made Cole trust him against his better judgment. He drew Lily up by inches until the edge would take her weight, and then pivoted his own hips to pull her across the lip without torquing the bad joint, a move his body remembered from litters and ladders and once horribly from a cliff. When she came over the edge, she did what children do when fear believes it can relax. She laughed a little through the tears. Hi, she said. Paws put his enormous forehead against her shoulder and held it there, the way large dogs know can make your heart slow. Paths licked the dirt off the back of her hand like it was a job that came with benefits. Somewhere far off, a whistle answered, then another. Then the visible beam of a light paintbrushed the trunks as a crew finally pushed through the deadfall. Cole keyed his radio. Got her, he said. Alive. Ankle injury. East of church by about 100 yards slump, hollow edge unstable. He almost added, don't bring Pike reflex, masked as pettiness, but he swallowed it. Mason Pike had a hand in every contract in town lately, and somehow in every argument about where to rebuild and where to declare a place unsafe. It wasn't the time to pick that fight. The time would come if the world kept its promises. He wrapped Lily's ankle with the part of the windbreaker that hadn't been chewed, and let Dr. Marisol's voice run in his head while he stabilized it. Don't cinch swelling, keep warmth in the core. Tell the nervous system a story it can believe. He told Lily about the dogs, in the voice he used when his own pulse needed a leash. How Paws could hold his breath longer than any dog in town if there was a scent to settle. How Paths had learned to ignore tossed food because work tasted better. Lily's face loosened at the corners. I know them, she said solemnly, as if that were memo-worthy in a report. They're Paws and Paths. He nodded. That's right. She put a hand in Paws' ruff to show she remembered how to use comfort on purpose, and leaned into Cole's chest the way kids do when the honest desire to sleep elbows its way through adrenaline. Hank came first because of course he did, his big shoulders making the burned saplings look smaller. He took in the scene with one glance and gave Cole a look that wasn't praise or correction but something older. Good work, he said, and it landed in Cole's bones like a weight finally put down. 2 volunteers followed with a litter. Tom Carter appeared as if teleported, and then had to be told by Hank to breathe so the men could do their job. Renee came after, knees buckling at the sight of her daughter, hands flying to her mouth, and then to Lily's hair, dropping 1,000 whispered apologies that belonged to no one and everyone. Cole stepped back because a man should know when he isn't part of a picture. Paws and Paths did the same without being told. And because Hank believed in teaching good habits on purpose, he reached down and raked his hand across both heads with a gratitude he tried not to make into a ritual. They moved as a unit down the creek bed, skirting a stretch where the ash disguised a pit that would have swallowed a careless foot. The litter rode smooth because Hank's crews were disciplined even when exhausted. That was the difference between volunteers and a team. Cole walked slightly ahead with the dogs clearing deadfall and felt for the first time how the ground under his boots could become a map instead of an accusation. When they reached the road, the gym lights looked too bright, the way civilization always looks when you've earned it the hard way. People clustered like islands in a tide. Someone started to clap. It was always awkward when gratitude got loud in public. Cole ducked his head and pretended to be very interested in the dog's leashes. A paramedic he didn't know raised a hand in a small private salute as the gurney rolled past. Renee looked back at him over her shoulder and mouthed the words he had been trying not to hear all night. "Thank you." He nodded because he didn't yet trust his mouth not to say "I failed at other things," as if the soul kept ledgers. They could have ended the night there with neat edges, but stories told to adults are not bedtime stories. On the way back to the trailer rows, Paths froze and pointed not the silly point for squirrels, but the hard point and low whine that meant a thing did not belong. The dogs' bodies angled toward the service lane that ran behind the gym where floodlights made everything cruelly honest. A rusted shipping container squatted beside the dumpsters, the paint bubbled like old varnish where heat had licked it. Cole had passed it a dozen times and filed it under "junk that isn't my problem." Now Path stalked toward it with his tail held like a metronome set too slow. Paws came alongside, not excited, simply convinced. Cole felt the small hairs on his arms lift under his shirt, the way they do when a word is about to be said that changes a room. He put 2 fingers to his lips and blew a sharp, short note that meant hold to men and dogs alike, then walked up to the container and laid his palm against the metal. Cold outside, warm underneath, in the way that says Chemical Nut Sunday. He dropped to one knee and put his nose near the seam at the bottom. The scent was faint but specific, like a name you recognize from a distance and can't place. Petroleum cut with a sweet top note and something acid that pinched his sinuses. Paws woofed, once the low vote of a dog who'd smelled that family of things before in a bad hour. Path's ears flattened in distaste. Later Hank said behind him, which meant he had seen the stance and connected the dots, and also understood, "We don't open Pandora's box in a crowd." Cole stood, nodded, and let his hand fall away from the metal. Paws gave the container one last long look with that same quiet stare he'd given the burned church. The 2 structures seemed to be speaking a private language, and Cole didn't like that he could almost hear it. He took the leashes and led the dogs back toward the FEMA grid. Inside his unit, the thin door clicked shut against the night, and the noise of the gym became a hum he could pretend was weather. He knelt and ran a hand along each dog's spine, feeling the healed ridges where Flame had once made decisions for them. And for the first time, he understood why Dr. Marisol had called scars maps you didn't ask for but can still read. He poured water, watched Paws drink like a gentleman, and Paths like he was trying to win something. He laughed without meaning to, and then sat with his back to the cabinet and let his head fall against it. Outside, a forklift beeped. Somewhere a mother cried, the soft, grateful cry you can't do in public. Paws came to lie with his shoulder pressed to Cole's knee. Paths stretched out long and rested his chin on the toe of Cole's boot like a bookmark. He closed his eyes and saw again the hole in the ground, the pale oval of Lily's face, the way the air had shifted right before she made a sound, the way the dogs had listened to absence and heard presence anyway. He also saw the dead steeple and the rusted container, and felt that unwelcome prickle along the back of his neck that told him tonight hadn't really ended anything. It had only moved the pins on a map. He reached for the radio without looking and pressed the button. "Hank," he said. The chief answered on the second hiss. "Yeah." Cole kept his voice level. Church site has a void space. Container by the gym is warm underneath with a petroleum suite. The dogs don't like it. There was a long breath on the line. Copy, Hank said finally. We'll lock it down and call it in. Another beat. The older man's tone softened in a way you only earn. Good tracking tonight, Mercer. Good dogs. The radio clicked dead. Cole set it on the counter and found he didn't want to let go of the silence yet, so he didn't. He looked at his hands, scar on the knuckle, where a nail had argued with him, thin white, cut across the palm that had come from glass. On the second day after the fire, the old puckered line near the wrist, from a time he kept in a closed room, and he flexed them, the way a carpenter checks a tool before a long job. He should have felt clean, emptied out by effort and relief. Instead, he felt that tight, bright readiness that comes in the hour after a crisis when you know you'll either collapse or commit. Paws shifted and sighed. Paths snored his ridiculous puppy snore, even though he was too old for it. Cole let his hand rest on both warm bodies, one palm, two lives, a triangle he could believe in. We're not done, he said to no one, and to the dogs, and to the version of himself that had almost stayed inside. He didn't need the night to answer. Somewhere outside, the wind turned, and brought with it the faintest thread of a smell he recognized now that he'd given it a name. He opened his eyes. The container would wait. The church would not move. The ground would tell the truth if you walked it with noses you trusted. He reached for the light, and let the room go dark around the three of them, like a hand closing, not to smother but to hold. The day had started in chaos and ended in a plan he could feel but not yet see. He was fine with that. Some maps only appear when you start walking. Paws shifted closer until his weight pressed like a promise. Paths, even asleep, turned his head toward the door. Cole breathed in the mixed scents of dog and ash and soap and something like copper, and decided to his own surprise that hope was not offensive after all. Behind his eyelids the burned forest rose again, stark and simple as a drawing. Somewhere within it, a line connected a church to a container to a hollow in the ground. Somewhere along that line was the reason the fire had behaved like a clever thing instead of a blind one. The dogs would find it. His job would be to read what they wrote in the air. Tomorrow he would begin. Tonight he let the images float and settle until they made a shape he could carry into morning. The storm broke the next evening with a violence that felt personal, as if the sky itself had been waiting for the right moment to shove him back into the worst corners of his own head. Thunder clawed at the walls of the FEMA trailer, lightning painted the thin ceiling an electric white, and the rain came in sheets that rattled like gunfire on metal. Cole Mercer sat at the tiny fold-out table, a paperback half open in his hands, when Paws lifted his head with a warning whine. Paths was already pacing, nails clicking, sharp ears pinned back. The second crack of thunder hit closer, sharper, and Cole's chest clenched so hard he nearly dropped the book. He had learned to hold his breath in firefights, learned to slow his pulse by counting backwards. But storms have a way of stripping men down to the first fear they ever knew. The trailer shook, and his vision blurred, with scenes that didn't belong in Montana, the desert, the roar of a rotor, the furnace blast of wildfire heat. He was halfway to the corner of the trailer, knees curling, when Paths tried to dive under the bed frame. The dog thrashed claws, scraping, wedging himself into a too small space like panic itself had teeth. Cole forced himself forward on his knees, his breath, ragged voice shaking but deliberate. It's just thunder, boy. Just noise. He pressed his palm under the bed until it found trembling fur. Paws, ever steady, leaned his body against Cole's shoulder, grounding him, reminding him he wasn't alone in the collapsing walls of memory. For long minutes the three of them lay pressed against each other, while the sky battered the roof, and slowly, like smoke thinning, the panic lifted. When the storm passed, the trailer smelled of wet dog and sweat and metal, but also of survival. Cole lay on the floor, exhausted, one hand tangled in Paths' ruff, the other on Paws' flank, and realized that their scars, visible and invisible, had just learned a new rhythm together. The next morning, Dr. Marisol Green stopped by, raincoat, dripping eyes sharp as always. She had a way of speaking that made it hard to dodge. "You heard the storm," she said, not as a question. Her gaze flicked from Cole's pale face to the dogs still pressed close to him. "Loud noises break open old wounds. Yours and theirs. The trick is teaching the body that it can live through the noise." She knelt to check the burns along Path's side, fingers efficient, voice soft. "These two will heal if you let them work. But remember, healing isn't the same as forgetting." She handed Cole a small tin of salve and then tapped her own temple. "The worst scars are maps up here. Learn to read them, or they'll keep steering you back into the fire." It was Hank Adler, the retired fire chief turned volunteer SAR commander, who gave Cole his next test. A neighbor had lost a set of truck keys in a rubble pile, minor to most devastating, to a man who needed that truck to haul supplies. Cole didn't volunteer. Hank just pointed at him and the dogs. "Show me if they're more than pets," Hank said. Cole felt the familiar urge to refuse to retreat, but then he saw the defeated slump in the man's shoulders and nodded once. He gave Paws the scent of an old glove. The dog's body shifted immediately, nose to earth, tail stiff, eyes alight with that almost eerie focus. Paths zigzagged ahead, casting wide arcs like he was painting invisible lines in the air. Within minutes, Paws stopped dead, sniffed once, and barked low at a collapsed beam. Paths plunged in, claws scrabbling, and unearthed the keyring from beneath a slab of char. The neighbor's face broke into tears as he clutched the keys like treasure. Hank said nothing at first, only crossed his arms and watched. Finally he muttered, "That's drive. That's what we need." Word spread fast in small towns. By evening, mothers pointed at the dogs with reverence. Children whispered their names, Paws and Paths, as if speaking them could summon courage. Cole felt himself shrinking under the attention, but the dogs thrived. For the first time since the fire, people weren't looking at him with pity. They were looking at them with respect. And yet, beneath the glow of small victories, the shadows thickened. It began with the container. Paths had returned to it during a walk, hackles up, nose twitching, and this time he pawed at the seam until Cole dragged him back. That night, unable to sleep, Cole replayed the sound of his claws on rust, the faint chemical tang in the air. When he asked Hank, the older man's jaw tightened. "We'll check it with the county. You keep clear until then." But Cole knew the scent of gasoline adulterated with something sweeter, sharper. He'd smelled it on burn lines overseas, on controlled ignitions, meant to wipe clean an acre. Someone had put it there, and someone wanted it hidden. Meanwhile, the church pulled at them like a magnet. Paws would stop every time they passed, the skeletal steeple eyes, fixed body rigid, as if waiting for a command only he could hear. One afternoon, Paths began digging in the ashen soil near the foundation. Cole followed reluctantly, heart hammering. Beneath a crust of char, the dog's paws struck something solid, iron-ridged. They uncovered the edge of a trapdoor, warped by heat but intact. Cole's flashlight beam found a seam descending into darkness. A draft carried up a smell of damp stone and something else, ozone metal secrets. He shut the light off, fast heart pounding. "Not now," he whispered, but the word didn't fool anyone. The dogs paced restlessly that night, circling the trailer like sentries. Cole couldn't shake the feeling that the storm, the keys, the container, the church, they weren't separate threads. They were a net tightening. In the quiet, he found himself talking to the dogs in a low voice. "We're being led somewhere. I don't know if it's salvation or a trap, but I think your noses already know." Paws looked at him with the steady patience of a soldier who waits for the right moment. Paths tilted his head, eager, reckless, ready. 2 days later, the weather cleared, and the town tried to act normal, hammering nails into new frames, hauling lumber, planting the first stubborn posts of a community reborn. But unease spread like smoke without fire. Tools disappeared from sites. Cans of fuel went missing. And more than once, volunteers whispered about Mason Pike, the contractor who seemed too eager to declare whole blocks unsafe and ready for sale. Cole caught him once, by the gym, standing too close to the rusted container phone, pressed to his ear, voice low. When Pike saw him, he smiled too quickly. "Good work with the dogs," he said, then walked away before Cole could answer. That evening, Hank called Cole aside. You ever think about making it official? The old chief asked. Search and rescue could use a man with your training. And dogs like that. They don't come around often. Cole stared at the ground. Commitment felt like a trapdoor of its own. We'll see, he muttered. But he couldn't stop hearing Hank's next words. Sometimes, the only way to keep your ghosts quiet is to give them work. As the sun bled out behind the blackened hills, the dogs grew restless again. Paws stood at the door, ears forward. Paths barked once sharp, urgent. Cole stepped outside. The church steeple cut the horizon, a jagged tooth against the sky. Without waiting for command, Paws trotted toward it, Paths at his flank. Cole followed, dread thick in his chest. When they reached the ruin, both dogs froze. Paths whined and began pawing at the ground near the trapdoor. Paws planted himself and stared into the hollow where the fire had gutted the sanctuary. The last of the daylight fell through the open roof like blood. Cole felt the prickle crawl up his spine again. He tightened his grip on the leashes and whispered, tomorrow. But deep down, he knew there would be no waiting. He returned to the trailer to find Dr. Green waiting, arms folded, face set. Your dogs are trying to tell you something, she said. You'd be wise to listen. She placed a small vial of antiseptic in his hand, fingers firm. Whatever you're heading into it isn't just smoke and ash anymore. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him with the weight of her unspoken warning. That night, the storm didn't come from the sky, it came from inside him. He dreamed of fire maps redrawn by unseen hands, of chemicals leaking into roots, of children's voices echoing in stone halls beneath a church. He woke with sweat slicking his chest, the dogs pressed against him, ears twitching, bodies tense. Outside, the world was silent, too silent. Paths suddenly lifted his head and let out a sharp bark. Paws followed with a low growl. Both turned their eyes back toward the steeple. Cole stood slowly, heart pounding. Something waited in that darkness, and tomorrow was already too late. Cole woke before dawn, though sleep had only ever come in fractured pieces. The trailer air was close, heavy with the musk of damp dog and the faint metallic tang from last night's storm. Paws lifted his head first, eyes calm but unyielding, as if already awake to the day's duty. Paths whined low in his throat, restless tail twitching like a fuse ready to spark. Cole strapped on his boots with hands that trembled just enough to remind him this wasn't habit, it was choice. He clipped the leashes, opened the door, and let the cold air slap him into clarity. The church ruin stood jagged against the gray horizon. Smoke no longer drifted from its bones, but the steeple looked less like a house of faith, and more like a warning finger stabbing the sky. The dogs pulled him forward as though the earth itself demanded an answer. Cole tried to swallow the metallic taste in his mouth, but it clung. He told himself he was simply following their noses. Truth was, he was following his own scars. At the threshold of the ruin, Paws froze, shoulders squared, nose working furiously at the ground. Paths circled wide ears, pricked tail stiff, then gave a sharp bark that echoed off the stone like a pistol crack. Cole's beam found the warped trapdoor the dogs had unearthed days earlier. The hinges were charred, but intact. With a grunt, he pried it open, coughing, as a plume of stale chemical-laced air hissed up. The dogs recoiled first, then pressed forward again, resolute. He tied the leashes around his belt and lowered himself in. The narrow stairwell led to a half-collapsed chamber, smelling of wet ash and something sharper, ozone metal oil. Paws descended carefully, deliberate nose close to stone. Paths bounded, slipped once, then steadied. At the base, Cole's light caught rows of crumbled pew supports, and stranger still, a reinforced hatch, half buried in rubble. It wasn't church work. It was industrial. His gut tightened. He knelt, brushing ash from the hatch. Scratched numbers revealed themselves, codes stamped in steel. Government surplus, maybe. Or private. His mind leapt to the rusted container by the gym, to Pike's too easy smile, to the way volunteers whispered about tools gone missing. He pressed his ear against the metal. A faint hum vibrated. Unnatural. He pulled back fast. Paws woofed once low. Paths began pawing frantically at a seam where air leaked. From that seam came another scent. Something human sweat salt. Faint but fresh. Cole's stomach lurched. Someone's been here, he muttered. He thought of Lily, of how easily a child could vanish into a maze like this. But when he listened harder, he knew it wasn't a child. The scent was adult. Male. He retreated, dogs close, until daylight greeted them at the ruin's edge. That's where Hank Adler appeared, face grim, radio on his hip. "What the hell are you doing down there, Mercer?" Cole didn't waste words. "There's more under that church. A hatch. Fresh scent." He studied Hank's reaction. The man's jaw locked, eyes narrowing, not in doubt but recognition. "Damn it," Hank said softly. "I thought we sealed all those after the fire." "All what?" Cole snapped. Hank exhaled, shoulders heavy. "Old mining stores. Before the county rezoned. Some of them got repurposed illegally. I heard whispers, but I didn't want to believe Pike had his hand in it." The name landed like a hammer. Cole tightened his grip on the leashes. "He's been sniffing around every rebuild. The container isn't storage, it's supply." Before Hank could answer, the dog's stiffened ears pivoting. Then, in perfect unison, they turned toward the ridge beyond town. A gust carried the sound of an engine backfiring. Paths barked once sharp, then lunged against the leash. Cole's blood iced. Something's happening. They followed the dogs through the scarred forest, boots crunching over brittle ash. The trail led them to the old creek bed, where the Carter family had been sifting rubble. Voices rang ahead, panic shouts. Cole broke into a run. They burst into a clearing where Tom and Renee Carter clawed at debris, faces wild. Lily Renee sobbed. She ran after the cat into the woods. "She hasn't come back." Cole's chest contracted. He dropped to one knee, presenting Lily's jacket from days before. "Fine," he commanded, voice steel. Paws inhaled, body snapping, taut eyes laser sharp. Paths circled once, whining, then surged toward the slope. The pursuit was brutal. The forest floor, weakened by fire, hid pits of ash and half-burnt timbers. Twice Cole nearly fell, once catching himself on a charred branch that split his palm open. Blood slicked his grip, but he held fast. Paws pulled ahead, silent, relentless. Paths ranged wide, barking sharply when the trail veered. Cole pushed harder, lungs searing, until the dogs skidded to a halt at the lip of a ravine. Down in the shadowed hollow, a small figure huddled, ankle twisted, face streaked with tears and soot. Lily. Relief slammed into Cole so hard his knees nearly buckled. "We've got you," he called. The girl sobbed, lifting her arms. But before he could descend, Paws barked, not at her, but at the tree line above. Cole swung his light. Mason Pike emerged from the shadow's flashlight beam, cutting across his smirk. "Quite the show you're putting on," Pike drawled. "You and your mutts playing hero while the rest of us actually build this town back." Cole's voice came low, dangerous. "You let her here." Pike shrugged, feigning innocence. "Kids wander. Fires happen. And sometimes progress requires sacrifice." The words hit like a match to tinder. Cole remembered the container, the hatch under the church, the chemical tang that didn't belong. His hand went to his belt where no weapon waited, only the leashes. But he had more than enough. Paws guard. Paths down. The dogs shifted instantly, flanking Pike, eyes gleaming. The contractor's smirk faltered as Paws' teeth flashed. Cole climbed into the ravine, heart pounding, and lifted Lily gently, careful of her ankle. Her small arms clung around his neck, her sob muffled against his soot-stained shirt. Above, Pike's voice turned sharp. "You think this proves anything? You can't stop contracts worth millions. You can't stop land that isn't yours from being cleared." Cole stared up at him, holding Lily close, fury a cold weight in his chest. "Maybe not. But I can stop you." Hank's voice cut through the darkness behind Pike. "Drop the bravado, Mason." We heard everything. Flashlights converged, volunteers, townsfolk, witnesses. Pike's face drained of color as Paws and Paths growled low, hemming him in. By the time deputies arrived, the hatch beneath the church had been sealed, the container impounded, and Pike cuffed and silent. Evidence, ledgers, emails, chemical drums would tell the rest of the story. Arson disguised as accident, profit dressed as tragedy. In the weeks that followed, the town rebuilt with new purpose. Cole and his dogs became more than survivors. They became the team others trusted when fear returned. Paws steady as stone, paths eager as flame. Together, they carved a new identity, not as victims, but as protectors. Cole accepted Hank's offer to join search and rescue officially. The ghosts didn't vanish, but they quieted given new work. One crisp morning, Lily limped into the SAR yard, cast on her ankle, a shy smile on her face. In her hands she carried a painted wooden plaque, two paw prints side by side. Beneath them, in childish letters, she'd scrawled, "Our scars became our map." Cole knelt as she hung it on the team's board. Paws leaned into his shoulder. Paths wagged, like the world itself was worth saving. And for the first time since the fire, Cole allowed himself to believe it was. And that's how Cole, together with Paws and Paths, turned scars into strength and gave an entire town hope again. From the ashes of loss, they discovered not just survival, but purpose. Now, we'd love to hear from you. If you were in Cole's place, would you have had the courage to follow the dogs into the fire-scarred woods? What part of this story touched you the most? Share your thoughts down in the comments. We always read them, and your perspective matters. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that like button. Share it with a friend who needs hope today. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss the next journey of Paws and Paths. Because every scar tells a story, and together we can keep those stories alive.